All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Nate G here on with Dr. Lisle. Dr. Lisle, how are you doing today?
Good to hear your voice again.
Excellent. So today we are talking about sexual trauma, sexual abuse, and all the things that go with it. Now, this could be a bit of a touchy subject for some people. So this is why we have Dr. Lisle, who's a PhD and a psychologist, who's probably seen way more cases than I have in my life about this, to kind of explain this from the lens of evolutionary psychology. So, Dr. Lisle, let's just tee off here. Have you just start.
Yeah, I would. And again, let me begin this by saying that what I'm sharing are my opinions, and then I will present some evidence that is consistent with my opinions, and then we will talk about evolutionary theory as it integrates in with the evidence, and obviously my opinions, because my opinions are going to be partially derived from evolutionary theory. And what makes this disturbing is that what it is that I think about this, and some of us, some of my colleagues, is very controversial and upsetting for a lot of people, and it's inconsistent with the standard way that psychologists think about these problems. Now, let me begin by taking let's first talk about what many people believe to be true. Many people believe that if you see problems of adjustment in adults, divorce, alcoholism, drug addiction, spotty, poor conscientiousness with respect to, credit and job stability, relationship stability and instability, et cetera, all the way down to inorgasmia in females and anything else that you can think of under the sun. What psychologists typically are thinking, or many psychologists, I shouldn't say all my colleagues, but a very, very large percentage of my my fellow psychologists will tend to think about these problems in the following way. If we see something that seems to be undesirable and maybe self-destructive and something like I said, addiction, or maybe obesity, for example. We see these things, problems that people are struggling with. We say, well, people shouldn't in principle have problems. It must be that these were caused by something. And so it must have been caused by something, obviously, that happened before. But the only problem is that when we talk to somebody that has problems at 35, when we talk to them, it turns out they were having problems when they were 27. Similar problems, okay? And then it turns out that when we talk to them a little further, while they were having those similar, essentially, cues or clues to those problems were evident when they were 18. And so we started thinking, well, the problem that got them off track must have happened before this. And so they continue to excavate into the person's history, and they come up with the idea that something must have happened early to cause the behavioral pattern that they're seeing that's problematic at 35 or 45 or 55 or whatever the issue is. Now, this isn't a stupid inference. It's just an interesting one. And unfortunately, they don't tend to look at these as hypotheses. They tend to look at it as obviously true because they don't have any other hypotheses in their heads. So as a result, what psychologists will do and have been doing for 100 years is that they've been looking for terrible things that must have happened in a person's upbringing that resulted in the dysfunctional things that they're seeing 40 years later, 30 or 40 years later, or whenever it is. And the thing is that they might not be able to see anything obvious. So they think, well, maybe it's something that I don't see. Maybe it's something that would be very, very impactful on human psychology. And what do we know that's very impactful on psychology? Well, if you're an adult, one of the most important things in your life is sex. And you think about sex, and sexual dynamics rule major, important, critical decisions and relationships in your life. So as a result, we are thinking then that something important must have happened to the child when they were 5, and an important thing might well have involved sex, and it wasn't a good thing, it was a bad thing, and therefore it sort of deranged the person's personality development. And that's why we have a person overeating compulsively at 38 years old, or they're an alcoholic, or they're 3 times divorced, or they've got an explosive anger problem, or they're a criminal, or whatever else. So this is the notion. Now, these are very interesting hypotheses, but it's going to turn out that nobody had bothered to actually look at this either critically from a theoretical point of view, or, more importantly, to look at it scientifically from that point of view. Now, from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, this is what we might suspect, although, like the other evolutionary psychologists might disagree with me. But this would be an in principle way to look at the way trauma would work on human psychology. If there is trauma, what trauma would be an event that took place where there was a substantial biological loss, and a substantial biological loss could be, for example, your arm. It could be your head, and you could be dead. It could be your little sister, okay? Something very important to you, your home burned down. In other words, there must be some statistical association with reduced likelihood of gene survival as a result of this incident, okay? That's what that would be. It could be that you were made a fool out of in front of everybody in your school as a 9-year-old, and therefore it was horribly traumatic to you. And, of course, this would make sense that this would be true, and you could have reverberations for years because it could have reduced your status in the village considerably and therefore reduced your likelihood of successful reproduction. So you can see, from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, the organism should be designed by nature to have memories associated with very substantial losses, and to not have memories associated with things where there's no significant gains or losses, because you can't store everything in a memory, so you better store the things that are the most important, things that are associated with either gains or losses, and keep a good accounting of those things. Now, and that's, of course, what it is that we find. So if you are dealing with animal memory research, or you're dealing with human memory research, you will find that the things that are going to be salient in memory and things that are going to be recorded well are going to be things that are, quote, important. And important is going to mean that there are large statistical variances between the survival of the genes, or essentially with either good things or bad things, for the genetic code. That's how the system should be designed, and that is how it's designed. Now, from this standpoint, I'm going to leap a little bit forward, and we're not going to talk about childhood sexual issues. We're going to talk about adult sexual issues for a minute so that we can understand why there could be a massive misunderstanding among psychologists about the importance of child sexual issues. If you are a woman, let's suppose you're 18 years old, 16 years old, 19 years old, 27 years old, 34 years old. If you are a woman who is fertile and you are raped, then it's going to turn out that this is a very significant biological loss. Why? Okay, it's a significant biological loss because in the wild, any unprotected sex act in humans between a male and a fertile female has a 5% risk of pregnancy. That means that if you consider that the job that a mother does in raising a child takes, let's just say for the sake of argument, it takes 20 years to get a child sort of fully viable. Now it might be less than that, and they start to get more and more viable and on their own by the time they're about 15 or 16 in a Stone Age environment, but they're still hanging around mother and they're still developing. So we're just going to call it 20 years. So think about 20 years of attention, and we're going to divide that by a 5% chance of pregnancy. So essentially that's 1 year of intensive attention that a mother would give a child. That is the biological cost of that sex act. Now, you might say, well, there's a 95% chance that nothing happens. That's true, but that's not how nature is going to work. Nature is going to be a statistical analytic engine that is going to analyze variances between things that are happening in the environment and how it impacts the organism's survival and reproduction, and it's going to encode neural circuits that are going to have reactions that are going to be consistent with those variances in order to encourage behavior that's optimal for the organism's gene survival. So therefore, a rape will be essentially the cost of 1 year of mothering to that organism. That is a very substantial biological cost. And so as a result, we should expect that the organism should find that to be very painful indeed, very disturbing indeed, and in fact it should be, quote, traumatized. As a result of being traumatized, what that means is it means that those memories are very high priority, and the events and environmental circumstances associated with that event are very important for the organism to pay attention to and to code those as potential correlates with that bad outcome. So, for example, I knew one person that I knew was raped by a man who shared a lot of characteristics with Johnny Depp. And as a result, she cannot really watch a Johnny Depp movie just because it makes her very uncomfortable, and it keeps bringing up the memories of that incident. And so what that should do is it should cause an avoidance reaction in the organism that essentially does not want that stimulus. So that should make perfect sense. This is no different in principle than if you eat something that makes you sick. The next time you smell it, it should make you feel a little ill, even though it might have been one of your favorite foods before. So this is essentially how the system would work. Now, as a result of rape trauma being very real, very biologically expensive to adult women, you can only imagine that the inferences. Incidentally, there's this decided lack of insight on the part of males about this, because to males, a sex act in principle could never cost them a year of their full time and attention, of the equivalent of a year of motherhood. So as a result, their attitude is sort of, hey, what's the big deal? Why make such a big deal out of it? Okay? Because to them, the biological cost is exceedingly small. So as a result, typically, the average male brain in natural history of this species has remarkably little insight into how impactful it might be on a female, or how unpleasant it could be to sort of force the issue a little bit if the female was not that interested, or all the way to major force of rape. Now, so that being the state of affairs, that's how this thing should be working, then you can only imagine the inside the head of the average human, particularly the average female adult, as she thinks about the possibility of a young person, much younger, a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, thinks about that person being sexually abused. Any normal person would say that is horrendous and horrible, because it was already really horrible for me, and I was a big, strong, 24-year-old, athletic, person with a lot of self-esteem. Think about how incredibly traumatic and horrendous this would be to a 6 or 7-year-old little girl or boy. It's inconceivable to them how bad this would be. They would estimate that the impact on this might be 10 or 15 or 20 times the reverberation that it was for themselves. And that's a very reasonable inference. However, it is not an accurate inference. Why? The reason is that, first of all, and we're going to, for all due respect to people that have been victimized in worse fashions, or in any fashion actually, but very little child sexual abuse has to do with penetration. So it's going to, I believe the statistics are that it's less than 2% of incidences involve this. So almost all childhood sexual abuse has to do with fondling, adults' nasty fingers where they shouldn't be, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so no one is saying that this is a good thing. No one is saying that this is a benign thing. However, what we're going to say is that it's not the same thing as a rape. And it's not even close to the same thing as a rape when it comes to the biological costs that the children are incurring as a biological entity. You would expect that the biology of the system should be tracking an event like a rape to a fertile female as being very, very traumatic in need, very expensive, code all aspects of the memory situation, and keep track of situations that are similar and avoid them. Okay? That's how that system should be working in order to help that female avoid that biological cost again, in case there's anything that she could do in her decision making that would reduce the likelihood of that happening in the future. Now, but the child, most victims of child abuse have been through an incident where they have not been impregnated. A year of their full-time attention and energy as an adult, as a biological system, has not been taken from them. And as a result, we should not expect the system to be traumatized similarly. We wouldn't expect it to be true based on basic evolutionary principles. And it's going to turn out that if we study rape victims, for example, we will often, but not always, find that the impact of this will last for many, many years as they continue to have inside their heads essentially a warning device that is put in there now, has been activated for them to steer clear of situations where they could lose another year. However, if you're a child sexual abuse victim, there has been no corresponding loss that looks like that. And so we wouldn't expect you to have a system that would be panicked about coding your way around similar situations. And not only that, it's going to turn out that your standing or situations with respect to other individuals is going to change dramatically as you get older. So we wouldn't expect you to be sitting inside of a traumatized 5-year-old psychology when you're 25 years old. It doesn't make any sense. So it's going to turn out that this question then was finally addressed scientifically by a team of researchers out of Temple University, and the lead author was a guy by the name of Rind, R-I-N-D. And what he did and his colleagues was that they actually looked at, I believe, on the order of 30 or 35,000 known cases of childhood sexual abuse. And then what they did was they correlated this with I don't remember exactly how this was statistically done, but effectively this was the net effect. What they did was they then looked on these victims and they found out all of the problems that had taken place in their lives, how many divorces, how much alcoholism, how many jobs lost, how much depression, how many visited psychiatrists, how many committed suicide, how many had bad credit problems, lost their home. In other words, all the major sort of psychological variables that you could ever think would be associated, any bad outcome, basically. And what they did was they ran a correlation against the experience of being a victim in childhood and the increased likelihood that one would have any kinds of problems of any kind as an adult. Now, what they found actually completely surprised me, because I did not expect the results to be just what they were. It turns out that the results indicated that there was essentially, for all intents and purposes, no relationship whatsoever between having been a victim of childhood sexual abuse and any psychological outcome that could be measured later on. Now, that actually the net effect was 0.9 of 1% of the variance was associated with having been a victim. That, folks, is nothing. So that means that some person that is overeating and has an obesity problem at 40 years old and can't figure out why it is that she can't lose the weight, goes to a psychologist who then tries to look for the puzzling reason why this is happening, and the two of them cannot figure out why she continues to engage in this self-destructive behavior. And I would tell them that it's the pleasure trap, that they're designed by nature to seek the richest food possible, and they're designed by nature to conserve as much energy as possible, and that these would be derivatives of straight evolutionary theory. However, that psychologist doesn't know this, so the psychologist instead is puzzled by the apparent self-destructive behavior, and they reason about it and they think about it, and they can't find any reasons in the present, so they keep marching back into the past. And they march all the way back to the childhood, and then they start speculating that maybe this individual must have had something traumatic. Well, traumatic wasn't being embarrassed in school about eating a hot dog and then throwing up on the plate. That isn't what happened. No, it has to be something very, very impactful for human nature. And the only thing that psychologists that can come up with that's impactful of any significance is going to be sexual in nature, because sex is such an enormously important part of life, and we certainly know very clearly that adult sexual trauma in females is very impactful. So therefore, it makes sense that somehow sexual trauma must be related to the problematic behavior that we're seeing in the 40-year-old. And there the analysis sits. And there the analysis sits and sits and sits, and the years of therapy go by, and the hand-wringing and the blaming of the father or the uncle or so forth for memories that may or may not be fabricated. And believe me, I'm not trying to minimize anybody's negative experiences that they have had at the hands of an abuser. I try to explain to people my position on this, that if I was 9 years old and some thug came down my street and grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and then snapped my arm over his knee and left me in the street squalling and miserable with a broken arm, that would be an assault, felony assault and battery with great bodily injury on a minor, and that individual should be incarcerated for many years for doing that. Okay? However, if we were trying to figure out why I had a drinking problem when I was 30, we would not say, well, gee, did you have anything traumatic happen to you in your childhood? And I said, well, yes, actually. When I was 9 years old on my street, this thug came down my street, and I argued with him about moving out of the way of his motorcycle because I was playing baseball. And he got off his motorcycle and he snapped my arm. And it was a disaster, and it was emergency surgery it said it was hell. Okay? We wouldn't then say, well, gee, that's the reason you're having a drinking problem. We wouldn't do that because it doesn't line up and make any sense to us. Now, what would we expect to have? We would expect to have me having a little extra anxiety around Hell's Angels. That's what we would expect 30 years later. Okay? We would not expect multi-dimensional, multi-system disruption in the psychology and the entire motivational system, as if the entire thing had been disrupted along all kinds of different lines. We would not expect that. The system shouldn't be that stupid. It should be very narrow and focused according to whatever the losses were. It should code anxiety and avoidance reactions specifically to those things. That way, if I get sick of some food, I don't then not want to eat any foods and have horrendous anxiety reactions and nausea reactions about any food. I have anxiety reactions and nauseous reactions about specific foods. Okay? So this is how my fellow psychologists have been lost. Dr. Rind published this paper with his colleagues, and I have to tell you, Nathan, that what happened next was a scandal in the history of science. It turns out that, of course, this was published in a mainline, top-of-the-line journal published by the American Psychological Association. So this was Cadillac A-grade science all the way. The reviewers that reviewed it couldn't see anything in the world wrong with it. It was superbly done statistical analysis. When this hit the rank and file in psychology, they flipped out. Okay? And the paper was vilified. It was actually it was condemned on both floors of the United States Congress by a unanimous vote. It turns out that nobody in that Congress read that study. Okay? There's only 4 people in the entire Congress that were capable of reading the study, and they didn't read it. But everybody voted against it. Okay? So what you have is basically people not wanting to look at the truth. And yet, what a tragedy this is to not look at the truth. Now, since I have spoken up on this issue, I have had many people come up to me, and they have told me, I was molested as a child. And I always wondered, with all of the news media and all of the psychobabble about this issue, they don't use the word psychobabble, that's my word, but they always worried that maybe there was something wrong with them that they didn't know about. Okay? And yet when I explained how this would work and how we would make sense of it, they were relieved and realized, I've always been a little bit worried about that, but now that makes perfect sense. And what you're saying is completely consistent with my life history. Okay? It seems maybe to some people that this would be unfriendly or insensitive, but I want to challenge anybody that's thinking that and any psychologist that hears me against that view, and I want you to look a little harder at this and try to put on a scientific hat and look a little cleaner. Because the truth is that if we do psychotherapy that is directed at trying to unwind child sexual abuse issues, and it turns out we're completely wrong, that all we're doing is digging up and reactivating unpleasant memories, and it turns out that those incidences don't have anything to do with the problematic behavior that the people are having in the present, then we are doing these people a tremendous disservice, okay? And we are prolonging their suffering and increasing it. So it is irresponsible to not actually look at the facts and honestly approach this problem as if maybe we've still got something to learn. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is so. Just in case people are interested in reading more about this study, this is Bruce Rind. You're saying
Right.
Bruce Rind, and he published a paper. What was the name? Let's see here. He was from Temple University, I believe it was.
Yeah, Bruce Rind. If you look up Bruce Rind, you will find. If you look at Bruce Rind, PhD, you will very quickly find this because he became infamous behind this, and effectively after Rind published. There was tremendous criticism, and I can remember reading one of the critics was some big shot statistician who said, "Oh my God, he violated all these assumptions in statistics that we have to use, etc." And as a former statistics professor myself, I rolled my eyeballs at this criticism. I couldn't believe that a fellow scientist would tee off in this way. And it turned out that what the Rind team then did is they went back and reanalyzed the data using that professor's criticisms and giving him the benefit of the doubt on every single measure that he proposed. And it changed the results from 0.9% to 1%. Okay?
Wow.
In other words, there was no wiggle room, and anybody that knew anything about stats, including that critic, knew damn well that there was no room in those assumptions. Statistics is very robust. When you start analyzing 35,000 cases, the truth emerges, and it's very clear what it is. And what we find is the best good news that was the least welcome good news in the history of psychology. And the least welcome good news in the history of psychology is that human children are robust to this kind of behavior on the part of adults and other children. Their long-term psychology has apparently been shaped by nature to not be particularly impacted by these incidences, as we would expect, because there's no dramatic biological losses that are being incurred at that time. And so we wouldn't have expected it from evolutionary theory, and we don't see it from the empirical science. And so this is actually extraordinarily good news. So the 21st century of clinical psychology, if they have the courage, the intellectual courage to absorb this extraordinary information, they can help the process of science advance our ability to do better clinical psychology and help many more people in the future than we're helping today.
Yeah, I can see why it's controversial because
Sure.
I'll give you an example that I don't mean to poke fun at this at all, but this happens, probably once a week at the grocery store where I go to the grocery store, I'm trying to get some pretty healthy food, and I look at the cookie box and the chips and all this stuff, and I know I'm not supposed to eat them, and then I'm examining it here and there, and then there says a word, vegan, gluten-free, organic, and bam, it's in my cart,
Sure.
Because at this point, it's like, well, at least I think that it's not going to harm me, so what the hell? So I can see why people would not like these conclusions because, I mean, what do you say to the pedophile who hears these conclusions and says, well, I might as well just what they do is they take away the moral conundrum.
Yes.
Away from their actions because, well, I'm not damaging the child psychologically, although they're doing something horrendous besides that.
Well, this is the issue, and it's just like the broken arm. So you can make a child's life miserable during this process. Some uncle that is molesting some kid for 4 years every time he comes over to the kid's house, on the weekends and making that kid anxious and nervous and feel yucky, it's terrible. Okay? These are criminal acts, and these people should be caught and appropriately penalized. But we don't need to then make the mistake, first of all, of thinking that they have destroyed an entire life, because they have not. Okay? And second of all, we also don't need to make the mistake clinically in our effort to be very sensitive about this. And I will submit to you that the clinicians have fallen into a trap where they are looking back to early childhood to try to figure out the mysteries of the human present. And it's going to turn out that the mysteries of the human present, obviously, when we have people with problems throughout their life, there's various and sundry reasons for those problems. Many of those problems are inherent in the human design as the human struggles under competitive pressures for esteem. And so people are going to be depressed, people are going to be anxious, people are going to feel intimidated, people are going to have low self-esteem. Under appropriate conditions, the organism is going to design those experiences as helping to help orient the organism to potentially more successful behavior. Okay, so we have to understand what much of the unpleasantness of the human condition is deriving from. However, there are other things that look to us like they're pathological. We have some person with a drinking problem, or we have a person that compulsively overeats, or we have a person that is, I don't know, whatever the issue is, is very, very flaky and irresponsible. And so we look at these things and we say, well, something bad must have happened early. And the truth is that by no means nothing bad had to happen early. These things are an interface, for example, between individual genetic variation and the modern environment that we have. Okay, and so that's why you'll see whole classes of gene pools where there'll be almost no alcoholism in the gene pool, and you'll see other gene pools where there'll be 50% of the gene pool will be alcoholic. And we know that these are genetic variances. 10,000 years ago, there weren't any alcoholics because there wasn't any alcohol. But now that you have a modern, unusual situation where you have a substance, for example, in this case alcohol or any drug, or, for example, modern processed-rich foods. So there's individuals that are more susceptible to those problems than others. All people are going to be potentially impacted by artificial process stimulation that is very, very hyper-palatable or very hyper-excitatory to the dopamine or endorphin pathways. So there are traps out there for people. But if we're going to try to figure out why Johnny is a heroin addict when he's 35, don't look to the fact that he was molested by Uncle Louie, because he was no more likely to be molested than any other person in the society that is not a heroin addict. His heroin addiction is not related to those early childhood experiences. That is very important for the future of clinical psychology, for clinicians to wrap their heads around this and to essentially get their attention focused on the things that we can do about the problems that we can change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what do you say to people who might say, well, the child loses trust in authority figures, or they are anxious when it comes to anybody? I mean, you said the Johnny Depp type of example,
right,
where anybody who kind of shares those characteristics.
Right.
From a general standpoint, does a child lose trust?
No, of course not, because the system wouldn't be designed to be that stupid. So the system is designed to, in this young woman's case, that if something looks like Johnny Depp, then the Stone Age brain says there's a damn good chance it was the guy. Mm-hmm. Okay? So the system doesn't feel that way about her other boyfriends or people that she meets. See what I'm saying? It doesn't mm-hmm. have that reaction. It doesn't get an abhorrence to sexual activity. That would be a biological disaster for that thing to code it in that way. Okay? Mm-hmm. What it codes is it codes anxiety around features, stimulus environment features that suggest that the threat is present and that we need to avoid it. That is exactly how an evolutionarily designed system would work. So the notion that you could say, oh, well, I lost faith in authority, there is no such thing as losing faith in authority. You can lose faith in specific individuals, okay, that betray you, then betray your trust specifically. That would make sense. It would never make sense to, quote, lose your faith in authority. That's absurd. Okay, there would be no neural circuit that would make that possible. So there's many of these notions that people have are very, very naive inferences about human psychology that are biologically impossible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, forgive my ignorance. This is
no
an
worries at all. No, these are
Yeah.
very good questions, because they are the questions that and they are the comments that I will often see in the news media about various issues, like, oh, well, doesn't this, mean that, I can remember when I was at the University of Virginia and the Challenger, I think it was the Challenger, blew up. And I can remember an idiot psychologist on the staff at the UVA saying, well, this means that children are going to be a lot more worried about nuclear war. It's like, you've got to be kidding. That was a dumbbell 115 IQ comment out of a dumbbell psychologist at UVA that didn't understand anything about how the human mind would be wired. There is no way that children would make that inference, and children in the United States did not grow up with an increased anxiety about nuclear war as a result of the Challenger exploding. Now, a few of them might have been a little bit more worried about going up in airplanes for a while, okay, until the evidence overwhelmingly contradicted that it was a problem, and then it's gone. That's how the system is a lot smarter than people think.
And then, so I'm assuming the same thing applies in sexual situations. So you have somebody who was sexually abused, or they were raped, some sort of trauma, and now they can't have. You kind of mentioned kind of an example. They can't have an orgasm, or they just they can't get excited, or they just they shut down.
No way.
What you're suggesting is that there's something else at play there.
Of course there is. In other words, the system is overwhelmingly, the entire design of the system is to reproduce. If it could be the case that we could have some unpleasant things happen early in its childhood that would stop that process from happening, you can, of course, realize that the genes that would be sensitive in that way would be selected out very quickly in evolution. Okay? So there's no way that that's the way this thing is designed. And the anxiety and avoidance reactions that a system has will be, as a result of the evolutionary design, commensurate with the losses biologically that are being coded, that are actually being experienced by organisms that have that experience. Okay? That is why it hurts less to have a hangnail than it has to then tearing the meniscus in your knee. Okay? That's why that works that way. The system is going to calibrate very well its pains and pleasures. That's why a couple of peanuts, unsalted and unroasted, they taste pretty good, but it's not as good as having sex with the most exciting person you've ever had sex with. It's not even close, okay? Because the system is essentially calibrating its feelings around the genetic profits and losses that are associated with those events. So this is where evolutionary psychology essentially looks at Dr. Ryan's data. Dr. Ryan, I do not believe, was an evolutionary psychologist or was informed about evolutionary theory. I don't think that that's true. I'm not very familiar with his work. I'm just familiar with this publication and its aftermath. But I don't believe so. But we can use the lens of evolutionary theory and look at this problem, and then very quickly realize that his results are not particularly surprising. Now, I was a little bit surprised, and I'll tell you why. Okay, I wasn't surprised that the results would be very mild, but I thought that the results would actually indicate an increased statistical likelihood of problems with these people relative to the base rate of non-molested individuals, because I believe that some of the molestation was coming from their parents. And that would indicate to me that their parents had some bad genes, had some problematic genes, and therefore I actually thought that the pathway by which we were going to see some significant differences in adult outcomes was going to be through the genetics rather than the experiences. That's what I was thinking I was going to observe when I read this article. When I found that the association was nearly zero, that surprised me a great deal, I have to tell you. And that's probably because most of the molestation that takes place is probably not within a genetic family. It's probably between the victim and non first degree genetic relatives, and so therefore that's probably why the correlation that I expected to be there, wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. Now, what kind of personality characteristics would be present in somebody who'd be more likely to do this to somebody else?
Oh, well, I think that this isn't that pleasant of a discussion, but I'll give you but I'll give it to you. What you're going to find is that there's probably going to be two main things that are going to determine whether someone is a pedophile. It's almost always men, by the way. It's exceedingly rare. Female pedophilia is exceedingly rare. That's because the female, DNA is so expensive. Women are designed by nature to protect their DNA, not to go out there and get it. And so this is a male-dominated, pathology. And you're going to, if you were to think about where this would make some sense, evolutionarily speaking, you would expect it that most of the problem would be with females just before puberty. And that is, in fact, exactly what you find. So, in other words, even though there are individuals that are attracted to 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, that's not where most of the action is. And incidentally, most of the action is heterosexual because most people are heterosexual by far. And so pedophiles are not just indiscriminate. They're just as discriminating as everybody else. And so as a result, most of the problems, most of the victims are girls. And so it's going to be the case that the girls that are going to be victims are most often going to be 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, right in there. And the reason why one would suspect that this is true is that effectively the perpetrators are essentially jumping the gun on the female fertility. That they, if you think about a biological bell curve inside of men's heads for when they would find females maximally attractive, you can imagine that the average male should find females maximally attractive at the peak of their fertility, which is going to be between 19 and 21. And that is where you're going to see the vast majority of models, Playboy magazine, et cetera, pornography, et cetera. That's exactly where you find it. Now, that it doesn't mean to say that men don't find women that are 40 and 50 attractive. They do. But they're going to find females of that age most perfect in terms of their analysis of their fertility. So that you're going to find the biggest impact there, and that's exactly what you do find. And so you're going to find that males that actually aesthetically prefer a 27-year-old over a 21-year-old are going to be a little bit unusual. Okay, so now we're moving off the middle of the bell curve into a gene or a gene set that is a little bit less common. We move it out to 45, now it's quite a bit less common, okay? So in other words, there's no doubt that our ancestral males, had wonderful, loving relationships with women of different ages, but the ones that were more interested in the females that did not show significant aging cues left more genes than the ones that were less discriminating, okay? So that is why 55-year-old women are not, leading women in Hollywood. That doesn't make sense to people. So so as a result, you can imagine in your head a bell curve of sexual excitation driven by specific genes, driven into making specific genetic circuits, genetically built circuits to cause males to be enticed. So we would expect that optimum to be right there, 19 to 21, which is where it is. We would expect it to be less prevalent by the time the female's 30. We would find it also equally less prevalent by the time the female's 15, okay? A 15-year-old female is considerably less fertile than a 20-year-old female, and the male mind registers that, okay? Now, you start to realize, well, wait a second, what about 14? So now it's going to turn out that there's going to be a certain percentage of males on that bell curve that's what they like, but it's going to be optimum for them, but it's going to be a smaller percentage than the 15 and a smaller percentage than the 16, et cetera. Keep moving down the bell curve into the tiny little tail, the very unusual variants. This is where you get, people that are extremely unusual in some way. So in the bottom 2% of a bell curve for IQ, we have what we call mentally retarded people. That's just where we draw the line, and that's the name that we give them, but it's just a little tiny slice, a very tiny little piece of the bell curve. In that same way, a tiny, tiny little piece of the bell curve, whatever this is, I'm not sure what it is, might be 1% of males or less, will find females that are 8, 9, 10 very sexually attractive. Okay? So there you have it. They are a genetic oddball. It probably also interacts, and it's probably not entirely genetic in the sense that it probably also interacts with sexual attractiveness yourself. So, for example, someone with pedophilic leanings might actually prefer girls who would be 15, but they don't have enough swab, and they're sufficiently unattractive, and the females are sufficiently well defended and sophisticated, so they're already defending themselves. And so our goofy-looking 30-year-old guy with no social skills that drools and can't speak very clearly, that guy has no chance at a 15-year-old. Okay? So as a result, he moves down the curve away from what is most attractive to him, but still attractive. This is exactly what a male does who's an 8 and a heterosexual and 40 years old. He also will move down the curve from what he finds most attractive, which would be a 23-year-old 10, and he moves down the curve towards what he can get that is still sufficiently attractive. So the same process is going on, except we're looking at a genetic oddball and possibly a social oddball as well, and it leads us into this unfortunate kind of criminal behavior.
Wow. Very, very interesting. So any closing thoughts as to, we did talk about this in great detail, and I hope any listeners that have any questions, feel free to email me or call in next show or anything like that, and we can talk more about it. But this has been great any final thoughts about, how to deal with this if it has come up?
Yeah. One of the reasons that this is a big deal is I've had parents whose children were known to have been victimized. And so when I explain this to them, it can be of enormous relief for them because they're thinking that their child has been badly damaged. And they're told this by their social workers and the psychologists and everything else. And it's a horrendous mistake, okay? And so this is not a cold evolutionary scientist with thick glasses and equations on the board being insensitive to humanity. That is not where this comes from. That's not where Dr. Ryan was coming from. That's not where I come from. That's not where evolutionary theory comes from. We come from a deep desire to figure out the truth, because it's only through the truth can we learn and modify our behavior in ways that are maximally effective. And so so in no way does this mean that I am insensitive to the suffering that someone may have done as a child. They may still have some memories that are very unpleasant from time to time, but I want you to know that this is not what is the main thing that is stopping you from achieving some very important stability or very important goals in your life. And it's useful for you to know that so that we don't crawl down the abyss of modern psychodynamic early childhood trauma therapy. Because that's a tremendous waste of potential human happiness.
Fantastic. And if any listeners have any issues they want to discuss with you, they can go to your website, esteemdynamics.org, and see if they can kind of answer some questions through some of the videos you have and some of the audio clips you have. And if it's something to get a consultation for, that's we've had a couple listeners who did that, and they did great. So they've actually emailed me. Had a wonderful time with you, Dr. Lisle. So